He wasn't supposed to be there, not anymore. But there he was, clutching his boarding pass with trembling fingers, his other hand gripping the leash like it was the only thing keeping him alive. His K9, Shadow, stood rigid by his side, muscles coiled like springs, eyes darting, too alert, too focused. People were staring now. TSA officers had started murmuring into radios. Something felt off. The veteran stepped forward. Shadow didn't. "Move," he whispered. Shadow growled. Low, subtle. A warning. And then he lunged. Passengers screamed. A little girl dropped her doll. 2 security agents reached for their weapons, too slow, too shocked. But Shadow didn't attack a person. He locked jaws onto a duffel bag lying near gate C14, dragging it violently away from the terminal doors. "Stand down," someone yelled. "Get the dog under control." The veteran didn't move. His breathing hitched as he stared at the bag now. Lying open, its contents spilled. Wires, clay, a digital timer. 028, 027, the K9 had sensed it, known it, before anyone else, before the sniffer units, before the X-ray scans, and yet Shadow wasn't even assigned to this flight. Not anymore. He'd been decommissioned, retired, his military chip removed. Legally, he was just a pet now. Just a companion to a broken man with too many medals and no home. So what was he doing there? Why, on the veteran's last scheduled flight to anywhere, would the dog risk everything? Because something wasn't right. Not just with the bag, with the whole thing. Because this wasn't the veteran's flight home. It was a setup. The veteran didn't even know he was walking into until now, and that bag. That was just the beginning. They never really came home, not him, not Shadow. Staff Sergeant David Kane returned from his final deployment with a stitched-up spine, shrapnel in his left thigh, and silence in his eyes. But it was the silence that weighed the most. They called him a hero, pinned medals to his chest. But he couldn't wear those when he went job hunting, or when the VA said the wait time was 6 months. His wife left 2 years before that. No calls, no letters, just the paperwork. Only Shadow stayed Shadow, the K9 that had saved 3 soldiers from a roadside IED. Shadow, the one who'd refused to leave Kane's side during that brutal desert firefight when air support never came. When the military retired Shadow, Kane fought tooth and nail to adopt him. They said the dog was too aggressive, too mission-driven. Kane didn't care. He needed him. Not as a partner anymore, but as an anchor. They settled in a cabin near an old airport town in Maine. Quiet, forgotten, just the way Kane wanted it. But something was wrong with Shadow. Not physically. Something deeper. He barked at the wind, growled at certain uniforms, refused to go near specific buildings. Kane tried to write it off as habit or leftover adrenaline from years of deployment until the packages started arriving, unmarked. No return address. Just slips of paper inside, coordinates, dates, photos of Kane. And once a picture of Shadow standing at their mailbox. He never reported it. Who would believe him? Just another paranoid vet living off pills and canned beans. So when the military contacted him last month saying they were offering free flights for veterans to reconnect with former bases, Kane hesitated. Then he agreed, not because he wanted to go back, but because Shadow wouldn't let him sleep. The dog paced at night, whined in his sleep, sat by the front door with his ears pricked like a soldier waiting for orders. Kane knew that behavior. He'd seen it before, right before their last mission, the one that was never officially recorded, the one that was supposed to bury secrets. Now, at the airport, with the K9's leash in one hand and a duffel on his shoulder, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by strangers but by ghosts. Shadow had refused to board the plane, sat in front of the loading gate like a stone. Refused to budge. It wasn't defiance, it was instinct. And in that moment, Kane remembered something the Army psychiatrist once said during his debrief. Sometimes dogs remember things we're trained to forget. And suddenly Kane wasn't so sure this flight was meant to reconnect him with anything. Maybe it was meant to erase him entirely. Shadow's refusal wasn't random. David Kane stood stiffly at gate 6, gripping the leash with a force that made his knuckles go white. Behind him, people murmured, irritated by the hold-up. A flight attendant politely urged him forward, but Shadow remained planted, growling low, his ears flattening against his head. Shadow had never acted like this, not even in the worst heat of Afghanistan, not when mortars fell like thunder. Not when soldiers died inches from them. Not once. This wasn't fear. This was something else. Kane crouched beside him, speaking quietly. "It's all right, boy. Just a flight. Just a trip. You and me, like always." But Shadow didn't blink. His eyes were locked on something. Not someone, something. He was staring past the boarding gate toward the dark corridor that led to the staff-only section. The hallway security avoided. The hallway Kane had almost missed. That's when it hit him. That wasn't a commercial boarding corridor. It was an access tunnel, one the military used. Kane's stomach dropped. Just then, a TSA officer approached. Calm, but too calm. His badge was blank, his name tag was scratched out. Kane noticed that instantly. His training kicked in even before his thoughts did. "Sir, is there a problem with your animal?" the officer asked, voice too smooth, too rehearsed. "He's just nervous," Kane replied. His voice didn't waver, but his hand was already inching toward the canine's collar, tightening grip. "We can escort you down the side entrance. It's quieter there." "No thanks, we'll take the regular boarding gate." The man smiled. That gate just closed. Kane turned. It hadn't. He'd been watching it the whole time. He looked at the flight attendant. She looked confused, as if she hadn't heard the exchange. Shadow growled again, louder now. His body shifted into a stance Kane remembered from war zones. Guard. Mode. Front paws slightly spread, shoulders stiff, eyes locked. Tail frozen. The man reached for Kane's arm. Shadow lunged, not at the man, at his bag. The zipper tore open under Shadow's bite and out fell a bundle of wires. A black device blinking red. Passengers screamed. Alarms blared. The man shoved Kane. "You idiot!" But he didn't finish. Shadow was already on him. Security swarmed. The man vanished into the chaos, disappearing like smoke in a sandstorm. And Kane, he didn't run. He didn't panic. He stared at the device on the ground because he recognized it. Not just the build, not just the brand of wire. He recognized the signature, the exact configuration used in the mission he was never supposed to survive. The mission that cost them half their squad. The mission buried in classified files, and someone had just brought it to a public airport. Kane was pulled aside, interrogated. His record was clean, his medical files were flagged, and the device, disarmed before detonation, was traced to parts purchased in 5 different states. Nothing added up, but Kane wasn't looking for logic. He was looking for patterns, and he remembered something else, the photo that arrived weeks ago, Shadow standing at their mailbox. He went back to his cabin that night. The moment he stepped inside, Shadow rushed to the bookshelf. He began pouring. At a lower drawer Kane hadn't touched in years. Inside was a file Kane had stolen after their final deployment. He'd kept it sealed in case someone came looking. Inside were photos, names, and mission briefs. One photo caught his eye, the same man from the airport. But he wasn't TSA. He was military. Rank, intelligence operative, discharged, dead, presumed killed in action 5 years ago. Now Kane knew he wasn't being taken back to a base, he was being silenced. But why now? Why involve Shadow? Unless... He flipped through more papers and stopped. There, clipped behind a photo, was a bloodied note written in code. A code only 2 people could have cracked. Himself and his old commanding officer, Captain Stroud. The man Kane had seen get blown to pieces on that final mission, unless he never did, unless it was all staged, Shadow whined suddenly. Not from fear, from urgency. He was pacing by the door, ready. Kane looked at the note again. It had coordinates, but not to a battlefield, to a place just outside DCA private hangar, one that didn't show up on commercial maps. And suddenly, everything began to unravel. Shadow hadn't just remembered. He had been trying to warn Kane. Every whine, every restless night, every instinctual refusal. Because Shadow knew They were walking into something bigger than just a flight. This wasn't about a goodbye trip. It was about stopping a mission that never ended, a mission that started years ago, and Kane had just found his way back to the center of it. But this time he wasn't going in as a soldier. He was going in as prey, and Shadow was already one step ahead. The coordinates led Kane deep into the outskirts of DC, past civilian checkpoints and forgotten roads, swallowed by overgrowth. With Shadow riding silently in the back seat of a rented SUV, Kane gripped the wheel tighter with each passing mile. It was almost dawn when they reached it. A hangar, old, weather-beaten, hidden behind rusted fencing and an abandoned property. No trespassing sign that was far too fresh. Shadow didn't wait. The moment Kane cracked the door open, the dog jumped out, nose to the ground, tail straight. This place meant something to him. As they neared the hangar, Kane spotted movement inside, shadows behind the frosted glass. Then a sudden clunk echoed. Metal, heavy, deliberate. He drew his sidearm. Old habit. He hadn't carried in years. But something told him this was no time for peace. Shadow growled low and pointed his snout at the main hangar door. Kane placed a hand on the dog's flank. "Together," he whispered. They pushed in. Inside, rows of crates sat under flickering lights, military grade, stamped with serials Kane hadn't seen since his deployment, back when the war was being fought in deserts and secrets. A terminal blinked in the far corner. Shadow paced. Kane approached the terminal and tapped the spacebar. The screen came alive. A video began to play, footage, him and Shadow, from the war. But not just combat, footage from inside the base, footage that never should have existed, private conversations, private meetings. Then, the final mission, the camera angle was wrong. It was from the trees. Someone had been watching the entire time, even during the ambush, even during the explosion, even as Kane bled in the dirt, dragging Shadow behind cover. This wasn't surveillance. This was orchestration. The video cut, and a voice filled the hangar, amplified through hidden speakers. "You should have stayed buried, Kane." Kane turned sharply, raising his weapon. From the shadows emerged a man, Captain Stroud, alive. Older, thinner, face hardened into something unrecognizable. He wore no uniform, just a black coat and gloves. Shadow barked, feral, guttural, ready to kill. Kane didn't lower the gun. "You died." Stroud smiled. "No, I disappeared. There's a difference." "Why?" Kane's voice cracked, not from fear but betrayal. "You think that mission failed? It succeeded. Just not the way you were told. We secured the payload, and we needed. A story, a tragedy, a distraction." Kane's stomach churned. "So you let them die. They were collateral, just like you were supposed to be." Shadow barked again, advancing one step, but Stroud didn't flinch. "That dog's a problem, always has been. He remembers too much. Smelled the detonator before the others. He's the reason you survived." Again, Kane's voice was ice. "What is this place?" Stroud gestured around. "A new front, not in deserts, not with soldiers, but silence, control, memory. Your mission didn't end, Kane. You're just waking up to it." He nodded toward a corner. Behind the crates was another dog cage. Inside, a German shepherd, just like Shadow, only sedated, wired, monitored, a prototype. Kane backed up slightly. "You're replicating K9 units. Not just replicating, programming. Them? Erasing instinct, installing control, no more emotion, no more loyalty." Kane's blood froze. That was why Shadow had sensed it. This was never about killing him. It was about replacing him, replacing them both, erasing the only two who still remembered what really happened. The final trap snapped shut. Stroud's voice turned cold. "But now that you're here, we can finish what we started. This time the explosion will leave nothing behind." Doors slammed, lights snapped off, and the hangar filled with a ticking sound, sharp, rhythmic, mechanical, Shadow. Spun in place, tracking, barking, Kane dropped to one knee. "Find it, now!" Shadow bolted toward the crates. Kane followed. His flashlight beam bounced wildly, catching glints of wire. Then Shadow stopped, barking hard. There it was, another bomb, smaller, crude, rushed, but deadly. Kane knelt beside it. My fingers trembled. He'd disarmed dozens before, but not with adrenaline this high. Not with betrayal flooding his brain. Then Shadow nudged his leg. Firm, steady. Focus. Kane exhaled, snipped the red wire. The ticking stopped. For a moment, silence. Then, gunfire. Stroud wasn't alone. Shots sparked from the catwalk above. Kane rolled. Behind a crate, heart pounding, Shadow charged. Not randomly, deliberately toward the stairwell. Kane screamed, "Shadow, no!" But it was too late. The dog launched up the stairs, straight toward the source. A scream, a crash, silence. Kane rushed after him. At the top, a body lay twisted. One of Stroud's men. Shadow stood over him, growling, wounded, but alive. Kane turned, but Stroud was gone. Disappeared again. The hangar burned behind them as Kane dragged Shadow out. They didn't speak. They didn't run. They just walked into the cold night. Not victorious, not safe, but together. And they knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The trial of Captain Stroud began under a veil of national silence, media blackouts, redacted files, witness protection for military personnel who dared speak, but Kane refused to stay quiet. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was under tight security. No cameras, no reporters allowed inside. Only select individuals with military clearance were permitted. Even then, most faces were unfamiliar, stiff-backed men and women in suits who had more to lose than gain. Kane sat in the front row. Shadow was by his side. Yes, by order of the judge. After weeks of petitioning, Kane's final request was granted. The dog testified, not in words but in presence. The room buzzed with discomfort. A dog in court. But this wasn't any dog. This was Shadow. And today he would prove something no classified document could. Stroud entered in cuffs. He looked older now, pale, but unshaken, as if none of this mattered. He sat behind his lawyers, whispering, occasionally. Glancing at Kane, the defense began their argument with confidence. There is no proof that the mission was orchestrated. The loss of life, while tragic, was due to combat unpredictability. Captain Stroud operated within his orders. Kane clenched his fists. The same lies. Again. But this time, he had something more powerful than evidence. He had Shadow. The prosecution took the floor, and with calm clarity they laid it all out. The video from the hangar. The GPS logs showing Stroud's faked death trail. The controlled K9 prototypes found in crates. And most chilling of all, the bomb Shadow had sniffed out. Each exhibit landed like thunder. But the room remained tense. Not everyone believed. That's when the prosecutor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to call our final witness." The room shifted. Murmurs spread. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Proceed." Kane stood. "Permission to approach with Shadow." The judge nodded. Kane walked forward with Shadow at his heel. He stopped just 10 feet from Stroud's. "Table, Your Honor," Kane began. "Shadow isn't just a military dog. He's the last living witness of what happened that day in Kunar province. He remembers, and today he'll show you." He reached into his pocket, pulled out Stroud's old service gloves, the same pair Shadow had once trained with worn, faintly marked with blood. He held them out. Shadow tensed, nostrils flared. Kane set the gloves on the courtroom floor. Then, quietly, "Shadow, who hurt us?" The dog walked forward slowly, step by step. The room held its breath. Shadow passed the first bench, then the second, then stopped directly in front of Captain Stroud. The man didn't blink. He smirked, as if nothing could break him. But then, Shadow growled, low at first, then louder. Then he barked, sharp, aggressive, lunged. Only Kane's hand on his collar kept him back. The courtroom exploded in chaos. Stroud flinched. For the first time, he looked afraid. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order, order." Kane stepped back, calming Shadow. He faced the judge. "He never forgets a scent, and he never forgets a traitor." Gasps rippled through the room. Stroud's lawyer stood. "Objection. This is a dog show, not a trial." The judge cut in. "Sit down, counselor." He looked at Kane, and then Shadow, then the gloves, and his eyes narrowed. "I've seen enough." He turned to Stroud. "You orchestrated the deaths of 6 soldiers. You faked your own death. You conducted unauthorized experiments on living K9 units and planned to destroy the last witness. This dog." Stroud didn't speak, but his hands trembled, and his smirk was gone. The judge's voice rose. "For conspiracy, treason, and attempted murder, this court finds you guilty." The gavel slammed. Shadow barked once as if he understood, and maybe he did. Outside, the sun broke through cloud cover for the first time in days. The wind was soft. Kane stepped down the courthouse steps with Shadow beside him. Reporters flooded the streets. Cameras finally allowed. Flashbulbs popped. But Kane didn't speak. He knelt by Shadow, wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck. "You did it, boy. You brought him down." Shadow licked his face. Once, then rested his head against Kane's shoulder, and for the first time in years, Kane smiled. Not because justice was done, but because loyalty had won. Against all odds, against a system built to forget. One man and his dog had remembered, and they had made the world remember too. No ceremony, no parade. Just silence. Kane sat in the back of the military transport van as it pulled away from the courthouse. Shadow lay stretched across his boots, calm now, his breathing slow and deep, like he knew the storm had passed. But Kane's heart hadn't settled. Not yet, because this wasn't just about Captain Stroud. It was about everything that came before, and everything still buried under classified seals. The government had offered him a quiet settlement, a full discharge, an NDA, and a "thank you for your service." He turned it down, because what Shadow had remembered wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The first real piece of truth came from a flash drive, one sent anonymously, days after the trial. The contents? Documents heavily redacted, logs, video clips from a base Kane had never stepped foot in. But the voice on the file, undeniable: Captain Stroud. The project's working. The chemical coding embedded in the new K9 scent receptors. They're following commands without hearing a word. One bark, one whistle, one flick of a laser, and they react like drones. Shadow was part of Phase 1. They don't know he survived. Terminate him before he remembers. Kane dropped the drive. His fingers trembled. They had turned dogs, loyal, breathing creatures, into weapons. Not companions, not soldiers. Tools. The mission in Kunar. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a test run. The reason Kane's team died was because they saw something they weren't supposed to. And the real reason Kane survived: Shadow. The one anomaly they couldn't control. The one they hadn't finished reprogramming. The next days were a blur. Kane didn't sleep, didn't eat. He followed trails, encrypted forums, hidden archives. Names popped up. Project Echo, the Obedience Protocol, and one name Kane had erased from his memory: Dr. Elena Murch, behavioral scientist, and the woman responsible for designing the neural scent training that had altered Shadow's brain. He found her in a retirement facility in upstate Maine, a woman long vanished from the military grid. Her eyes widened when she saw Shadow. She gasped, then whispered, "They told me he died." Kane didn't reply. He just sat. Shadow placed his head on her lap and she cried for a long time. Then she told Kane everything. "It was never about making the dogs better," she said. "It was about making them obedient, fully, without conscience, without resistance." Kane sat frozen. They tested chemical triggers, reward and punishment loops hardwired into the dog's neural cortex, but with Shadow, she looked down at him. He resisted. No matter how many injections, no matter how many tests, he always remembered you, Kane whispered. "Why?" She smiled through the tears. "Because he chose you. And that kind of bond, it can't be programmed." She reached into her drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside, photos, handwritten notes. One stood out, a photo of Kane and Shadow from years ago when he first adopted the pup as a fresh recruit. The back read, "Case the Mazo 9, control failed. Loyalty persists. Result, incompatible with weaponization." They had marked Shadow for disposal, even back then, but he survived and protected Kane, all because of something no algorithm could replicate. Love. Days later, Kane stood at the airport terminal, the same one where it all began. Only this time there was no crowd, no screaming officials, just him and Shadow, a new ticket clutched in his hand. Destination undisclosed. A private organization had contacted him, voluntarily. One run by ex-military whistleblowers. They helped rescue K9 units discarded after war. Shadow would be their ambassador. Kane their advisor. But before boarding, Kane paused. Shadow sat by his feet, watching planes take off. Kane knelt beside him. "I don't know where this ends," he murmured. "But I do know one thing." He looked into those familiar eyes. "You remembered when no one else did." Shadow leaned forward, touched his forehead to Kane's, a silent oath. They would never forget again. As the plane took off, Kane glanced. Out the window, below, the city shrank, but something inside him grew. He had uncovered the truth, but more than that, he had honored it. And now, it was time to make sure no one ever forgot what loyalty truly meant, even when the world tries to erase it, even when it hurts. Because sometimes, a soldier's last mission isn't on the battlefield, it's in the silence that follows. In the dog, who stays behind and refuses to leave. The plane landed quietly in the misty morning of a hidden airstrip in Alaska, where the cold bit deep and secrets stayed frozen for decades. Kane stepped off first, gripping his duffel. Shadow trotted beside him, alert but calm. They were greeted by two men, former intelligence officers turned whistleblowers. They didn't smile, didn't shake hands, just nodded and led the way. Deep in the facility, part cabin, part bunker, Kane was shown to a room filled with crates, each marked with military serial codes. One of the crates bore a label, Echo X-17, retired K9 unit, status, deceased. But when Kane pried it open, his breath caught. Inside was another dog, older, weaker, half-starved, but alive. His tags, Thor, Unit 3. Beta Shadow stiffened beside Kane, his ears perked, then lowered. Recognition. Kane stared. "They told me Thor died in Kunar." One of the men behind him spoke. "Quiet. That's what they wanted everyone to believe. Thor didn't die. He was reconditioned, tested, then locked away when he started remembering his old handler." Kane swallowed. His knees nearly gave out. "His old handler?" The man nodded. "You." Kane looked down at Thor, once his backup K9. A dog he hadn't seen since the night the ambush tore their squad apart. Thor whimpered, limped forward, and gently rested his head on Kane's knee. Shadow didn't growl, didn't flinch. He leaned. Into two dogs, once brothers in battle, now survivors of betrayal, and Kane realized this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much darker. Because if Thor was still alive, how many others were? How many K9s had been silenced, buried, or brainwashed, waiting to be remembered? Kane looked up, eyes burning, jaw clenched. "We find them all," he whispered, "every last one." And behind him the wind howled through the pines, like ghosts waking up. Months passed. The world moved on. New headlines, new wars, new distractions. But Kane didn't. He lived now in a world most people never saw. One made of whispers, old files, and broken chains. The facility in Alaska expanded, slowly, carefully. Word spread through hidden channels. Former handlers reached out hoping, grieving. Some were too late, but others weren't. Shadow became the symbol of something sacred. Memory. He led missions, not with teeth, but with trust. Finding old K9 units buried in black sites, forgotten, kennels and decommissioned labs. Each rescue was a piece of the puzzle. Each name remembered was a victory. And Kane? He didn't need medals anymore. He needed truth. One night he sat by the fire, letters sprawled out in front of him, handwritten, from families of handlers who never came home, but whose dogs did. Shadow lay by his feet. Thor, now stronger, curled nearby. Kane picked up a letter. Read it aloud softly. My son used to say, "My dog listens better than my CO." After he died, we were told his K9 had been euthanized, but then we saw a photo, and there he was, alive, because of you. Kane folded the letter gently. Tears welled in his eyes, but they didn't fall. He'd cried enough, now was time for something else, purpose. He reached down, resting a hand on Shadow's neck. "You kept me alive," he said, "so I could keep them alive." Shadow didn't move, he just leaned in, and for the first time in years, Kane felt peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he wasn't alone in it anymore. One morning, snow fell softly over the compound. A new dog arrived, scared, thin, eyes clouded with confusion. Kane knelt down, slow and gentle. Shadow stepped forward first, nose to nose, and just like that. The new dog sat, accepted, welcomed, the way soldiers are supposed to be. Not as weapons, but as warriors, as family. And as the fire cracked and the mountains stood watch, Kane whispered the promise again. One he would never break. You are not forgotten. Not anymore. Shadow refused to leave the airport because he knew something no one else did. But was it loyalty or was it a warning? What do you think Shadow was trying to protect Kane from? Comment your thoughts below. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes dogs are more than just animals. They're guardians of our souls.